Yeah, the title says Working with Louis, a Physicist's Perspective, but those of you who saw just the first page of my talk, a more precise title would be Working and Sparring with Louis, some personal recollections. And I think anybody in this room who's interacted with Louis, either as a group member or as a competitor, would appreciate the sparring part. But I have to tell you, it was a very positive experience, certainly in retrospect, but even at the time I thought so. Okay. Anyway, first of all, I would like to express my appreciation to the organizers of this wonderful Centennial Symposium to honor the memory and career of Louis, clearly one of the most remarkable experimental physicists of the 20th century. And it's particularly meaningful for those of us who had the opportunity of working with him, and certainly a privilege for me to be one of the speakers. Before going further, I should offer a caveat emptor with the following observation. In today's symposium, most of the speakers and I overlapped as members of the Alvarez bubble chamber group, which would probably lead to some overlap in our accounts, which could provide a Rashomon-like experience following the Japanese tale of several witnesses to the same event who then recounted very different versions of what they observed. Nonetheless, while our memories of that era and our interactions with Louis may differ somewhat, I suspect that on the whole they're quite consistent, if not identical. As was indicated earlier, Louis's career was especially noteworthy not only because of the importance and sheer number of his innovations and discoveries, but also by the unusually wide spectrum of topics covered from cosmic rays to nuclear physics to particle physics, with a significant detour into radar work during World War II, resulting in his development of the ground control approach, GCA system, which had a major impact in aviation and for which he won the Collier Trophy. Impressive as all this was, he then followed with his last great work, a collaboration with his son Walter and his team at the Lawrence Berkeley Lab on the extinction of the dinosaurs. In his discussions with members of our group, Louis often prided himself on persistently having changed research careers every few years, and it's a great lesson for the rest of us. So Louis had an uncanny intuition about physics and technology, coupled with an insatiable curiosity about the world around him. After eventually taking much of this for granted, you know, when you're around Louis for a long time, you just begin to take all this for granted. But my appreciation of these attributes was refreshed a few years ago when I gave a number of colloquia on the topic Unconventional Physics, Breakthroughs, Breakdowns, and Reactions. Now, in that presentation, Louis figured prominently as I discussed events surrounding his work on the Kennedy assassination, X-raying the pyramids, and the dinosaur extinction as examples. Despite many other events discussed in the talk, the reaction from the different audiences, especially the students, was mostly focused on Louis and his amazing versatility and breadth of interest, even without me mentioning his other work related to what he won the Nobel Prize for, or for which he also got his other work on, which led him to be a member of the Inventors Hall of Fame. So, what was it like working with Louis? The short and incomplete answer is very stimulating, challenging, and sometimes frustrating. Because Louis was who he was, the longer answer, embedded in my recollections of him, also embrace three themes which were very important to me, certainly, and I hope to others, namely the role of the individual scientist in this era of big science and team research, the sometimes skeptical reaction to breakthrough ideas introduced by scientists outside the specialty affected, the so-called not invented here syndrome, and lastly, the challenge to provide flexible support to scientists if they should have excellent curiosity-driven ideas outside their specialty. This particularly resonates with me as a petit fonctionnaire in Washington when we have review panels giving their assessments of the more conventional ideas. When new ideas come up, the so-called peer review sometimes says, well, this looks too iffy. And so we have to try to get out of the box in making these decisions. Anyway, when I was a grad student in high-energy physics at Berkeley, starting in the 50s, I spent a few months in the Alvarez bubble chamber group at the RAD lab, as it was known then, before switching to the Moyer-Helmholtz group to do experiments using fast electronic counter techniques. Amongst my fellow graduate students at that time were Stan Wojcicki and Oren Dahl in the Alvarez group, and Barry Barish, the present APS president, in the latter group. There were many other grad students at the time, but these are a few who started grad school exactly the same time as I did. After I got my PhD, I drifted back immediately to bubble chamber physics, first with Philippe Eberhard at the Collège de France in Paris for a year, and then at the University of Illinois with Bob Hulsizer and his group, who were collaborating with the Alvarez group. After 2 years of commuting between Urbana and Berkeley, I was invited by Louis to join his group at the lab as a research physicist, and I arrived in 1965, and as Lena indicated, I basically stayed there for the next 40 years, including a stint as leader of the group a few years after Louis stepped down as group leader, and following Art Rosenfeld in that capacity. I don't know about Art's experience, but as group leader, I interacted with Louis almost on a daily basis, sometimes several times a day, which made for a stimulating, if sometimes challenging, experience. But more about that later, if time permits. So the period from the mid-1950s through the 60s represented the heyday of the bubble chamber program developed by Louis and the group, and so was a most exciting time to be there. The coming together of the technological marvels of the various bubble chambers his team designed and built, culminating in the 72-inch chamber, and the simultaneous development of the analysis systems resulted in a veritable explosion of new particles and resonances discovered, starting with the Y*1 from the 15-inch chamber data by a team which included our final speaker today, Stan Wojcicki, when he was still a graduate student. It seemed like not a week went by before yet another discovery was made. At that time, the group was the largest high-energy physics group in the world. So some of the concerns about joining the group, and amplified many-fold by social scientists of the day, lamenting the impact of big science, were the possible anonymity of the individual scientist and the dangers of conformity of thinking within large groups. Louis, to his credit, aggressively laid those concerns to rest. He was an ardent foe of groupthink, which he characterized as intellectual phase lot. I love that expression. For that matter, he was just as much against intellectual phase lot from individuals as from groups by regularly challenging our assumptions and pronouncements. This was also his way of learning. To that end, he interacted regularly with individuals in the group, from grad students and postdocs to senior scientists, to keep abreast of what we were doing while providing the additional benefit of sharpening our thinking, sometimes painfully, and challenging any sense of anonymity. Another factor was structural. Because there were so many fundamental topics and issues to be addressed, we naturally divided into smaller subgroups to tackle the different problems, with the result that we didn't feel as anonymous cogs in a bigger wheel. Finally, one of the most important factors which contributed to the feeling that we were an intimate research group and also provided me the most stimulating experience was the institution of the weekly Monday night seminars at Louis' home that Rich referred to. This was a memorable series, made especially so by Louis' role. Because of its impact on many of us, I'd like to describe it briefly in a little more detail than Rich did, just to emphasize the different aspects of the thing. So the ground rules were simple. The meetings were every Monday night, except for Christmas and holidays that fell on that day of the week. Louis and Jan, his wife, provided the refreshments of coffee, cookies, pretzels, and beer. The first 15 minutes were devoted to news briefs, that is, science, news, and gossip from around the world, diligently prepared during the week and usually delivered by a postdoc or grad student in the group. This was then followed by an hour or so of presentations of the seminar speaker. The audience was encouraged to interrupt with questions or comments at any time, subject to Louis' intervention if it got out of hand, which is really ironic since he was often the instigator of most of these things. But lessons to be learned. Okay. So the two most important rules that Louis insisted on were don't spill drinks on the carpet, and the second one was the name of the speaker must never be allowed to be known in advance. This latter rule he enforced stringently as a matter of principle because he didn't want these meetings to become popularity contests. He wanted people to show up to these meetings because of the stimulation of the give and take amongst the audience as well as the speaker, and he certainly didn't want to prejudice the audience against the graduate student speaker. So Louis sat in his armchair in the front row, always in the same place, to the side of the speaker, and I think it was a conscious courtesy to avoid being in the speaker's direct line of vision so that he wouldn't intimidate him. The speakers included grad students and physicists from the group, as well as physicists from other groups and visiting scientists. The seminars and the discussions, often instigated by Louis' questions, were usually spirited and almost always very stimulating. We looked forward to these meetings, even after being sleep-deprived from taking shifts at the Bevatron. Visitors included theorists such as Richard Dulles, Edward Teller, and Freeman Dyson. Charles Wohl reminded me that Louis introduced Dyson as the scientist who talked himself out of a Nobel Prize by recommending someone else. And you can figure out who that was. Typical of the seminars on topics remote from particle physics was the spellbinding talk on the first successful human-powered aircraft flight across the English Channel by the leader of the team, Paul McCready, who described the evolution of the project from conception to the flight of the Gossamer Albatross with a cyclist pedaling to drive a propeller. Imagine that. Here's a particle physics group, and these are the type of topics were covered. It was truly amazing. Another riveting speaker was the designer of the first Hewlett-Packard pocket calculator, the HP 35, who described the history and design of the device. We were able to get him as a speaker because Louis was on the board of directors of HP at the time and suggested this would be a worthwhile speaker, and he certainly was. Unfortunately, I don't remember his name. No, it wasn't Oliver that gave the talk. It was somebody else. Anyway, yet another seminar which I found intriguing was one given by Jerry O'Neill from Princeton, who was a high-energy physicist, but has shifted his interest to space science. He'd recently created a private company called Geostar and was planning to launch a small communication satellite to test a position determination system he was developing to track aircraft. As O'Neill was describing his Geostar activities, Louis had what I would characterize as a eureka moment. Interrupting the speaker, he turned to the group and explained something to the effect that this is a license to print money. And then he went on to speculate how this could be extended well beyond aircraft to commercial fleets of buses, cars, and trucks outfitted with transponders where the owners could eventually track locations of their vehicles to within at least a few hundred yards, possibly better. He ended by saying that he thought that depending on the technology development and price, such transponders could eventually be used to track private vehicles and even people with greater accuracy. Talk about prescience. This was many years. Okay, Lena's giving me the warning. Okay. So let me, the spirit in these seminars was largely influenced by Louis' curiosity to learn more and his encouragement to the rest of us in the audience to speak out. To illustrate, during one seminar where a speaker continued with theory jargon-filled description, despite many requests to reduce the jargon usage, Louis lost his patience and barked to the audience, "Are you going to let him get away with it?" And while this wasn't the most polite of interventions, it certainly was effective. He was more considerate of the graduate student speakers, but not to the point of giving them a free pass on their presentations. After the fact, most of the students I talked to felt the experience to be of significant benefit, quote unquote. I believe they were sincere in their assessment. One of them described his first experience as similar to the relief felt from a successful bowel movement after a bout of constipation. And I think from the reaction of the audience, you don't have to be anal to appreciate that image. So let me skip to, since time is running out. With regard to concerns about working in a big research group, Louis strongly supported the role of the individual and vigorously confronted groupthink conformity. On the contrary, I think much benefit from the stimulation and vitality of diverse views of my colleagues provided a nurturing environment for new unorthodox ideas. Now I want to mention just briefly an observation with regard to Louis that will be discussed by Walter and others. When Louis was working on the extinction hypothesis, his office was close to mine, and I remember him sitting at his desk, a solitary figure, surrounded by pictures of his physics heroes, and I think you had one of the pictures up there. And there he was, pounding away hour after hour, week after week, on his tiny HP pocket calculator. He was trying to calculate the effect of a 10-kilometer asteroid striking the Earth with enough energy to vaporize itself and many times its weight of rock. The thing that's interesting in this, as he was doing this, I'll skip some of this, is that what was amazing in retrospect was that this one person with a pocket calculator was anticipating the studies of a nuclear winter caused by the detonation of many nuclear bombs done by large teams of scientists using state-of-the-art powerful computers. Admittedly, they came up with more accurate, detailed models, but the gross features were very similar. So it's amazing that one individual did what these big teams do. The other, I was going to go on to, I'm running out of time, so let me skip to a few things. Where Louis could be less than diplomatic, to say the least, was occasionally while he was competing for resources support for his bubble chamber program, and also when he met resistance from the Rad Lab management as he eventually tried to shift his interest from accelerator-based particle physics to space-based studies of high-energy particle interactions and cosmic rays, particularly looking for antimatter and primary cosmic rays. Now, think, this was about 40 years before the launch last spring of the Endeavour shuttle carrying Sam Ting's AMS spectrometer to install in the space station to do the same thing. So Louis was really ahead of his time. As he tried to get his support for his balloon-based experiment called HAPPY, I remember being frustrated by the argument this wasn't part of the mission of the lab or the AEC agency at the time. His response, delivered quite undiplomatically at times, was that it should be. In the end, Louis prevailed and eventually led to an outstanding diverse astrophysics program at the lab with the likes of former particle physicist Rich Muller and George Smoot, and then another particle physicist, Gerson Goldhaber, as well as finally Saul Perlmutter, who shared this year's Nobel Prize in Physics. So, in looking at this, I say, what a wonderful legacy. And it's all the more so despite the initial resistance. In any case, apart from his own experience, Louis was generally concerned about tendencies of intellectual and fiscal inertia in the scientific community and the funding agencies respectively, even with their peer review panels that I referred to, which could inhibit the incubation of new cross-disciplinary ideas and programs. Needless to say, this is an ongoing challenge. To summarize what it was like to work with Louis, I want to offer the following true anecdote. I often had to go back to the lab after hours and on weekends, and quite often I would take my two young sons with me because we didn't have a babysitter at that time. And I didn't think anything about it. A few years later, I learned from them that they thought that when we were going up to the lab that I was paying the guard at the gate. When I was showing them my badge, they thought I was paying the guard at the gate to let me go in to do some work. And, you know, I was stunned by it, but I must say thrilled at the same time. And the fact of the matter is I probably would have paid to go in to be able to work with Louis, okay? And to conclude with another perspective of Louis, I'd like to quote from Richard Feynman's book, What Do You Care What Other People Think? which describes his experience on the Rogers Commission investigating the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. And I really believe it captures an essential component of Louis. In this excerpt, Feynman is ruminating the night before whether to go through with the O-ring and ice water experiment during the actual hearing on the following day. And he writes, "I think I could do this tomorrow while we're all sitting around listening to this Richard Cook crap we heard today. We always get ice water in those meetings. That's something I can do to save time." Then I think, no, that would be gauche. But then I think of Louis Alvarez, the physicist. He's a guy I admire for his gutsiness and sense of humor. And I think if Alvarez was on this commission, he would do it, and that's good enough for me. The rest, they say, is history. Thank you for your attention.